As you all know, unless you've been living under a coal chute, the Railway series is what Thomas the Tank Engine is based on. Written by Wilbur Awdry and continued by his son Christopher. Today, I will be discussing the top 10 worst Railway series stories. Of course, this is all just my opinion, and if you disagree with me, that's totally fine. Anyways, without wasting any more time, let's begin the list. I'm sorry that this intro is a bit abrupt. I am terrible at intros and outros. Number 10. Fire Engine. Now let me just emphasize that I don't think this story is bad. On its own, the story is fine. It's a decent Henry and James story, and has a realistic situation about fire. So it's not the story itself that's the problem. It's where it's placed in the series. This story is placed in the 28th book, James and the Diesel Engines, but yet the story has absolutely nothing to do with diesels. Like, it's called James and the Diesel Engines. Where are the diesel engines? I see James, but I don't see any diesel. Now, the book is already poorly structured enough, but this story feels like a last-minute addition because they needed a third story, and this is what they came up with. Overall, again, I don't think this is a bad story. I just feel like it should have been placed somewhere else in the series, like Henry and the Express, for example. Or if you want it to still be in the book, why not replace Henry with a diesel, like Old Stuck-Up, for example? He was introduced at the beginning of the book. This story is the perfect opportunity for us to know more about him. Number 9. Sir Handels Plan. Alright, now on to the bad ones. The reason this story is on the list is because it's kinda disappointing. Since this story is in a book called New Little Engine, and it's literally called Sir Handels Plan, I would have thought it'd be a story about Sir Handel trying to come up with a name for the new engine. But no, this story has absolutely nothing to do with the New Little Engine. Alright, what about the story itself? Well, in my opinion, nothing happens in it. Peter Sam comes home to the railway and Sir Handel is for some reason upset about it. Then when he sees Peter Sam struggling, he decides to break down on purpose? What? Okay, this story is already not good. But then the rest of it is just Sir Handel sulking in a shed. He then owns up to his mistake, and then the story ends. It never really felt like the story started. New Little Engine is already a messy book, and I'll explain more later on. Overall, I would much rather have a story focused on Sir Handel trying to think of a name for the New Little Engine, even if it's just a three strikes formula story. And at the end of the story, when he finally comes up with it, the narrator could say,
"But we must say no more, or we'll spoil the next story."
Number 8. Thomas and the Swan. What's with me putting stories or episodes with Thomas in the title in the 8th spot? We had that with the classic series, and now we're having it here. Anyway, the reason this story is on here is because it feels really bittersweet. This is famously the story where Gordon retires from the Express. We get a nice scene at the beginning that explains this, but the scene is shoehorned into an unrelated story about Thomas and a frickin' Swan, which is a story that's present in the annuals. Why is this even a thing? Why couldn't it be a story about Gordon learning to accept retirement? Oh, I know why. Because Chris needed to include Thomas in some way. Overall, not much else to say. Number 7. Tobys' Vintage Train. Now, I originally had overloaded here because of its bad illustrations, and the idea of Victoria being in the brush for many years seems a bit dumb to me, but I eventually decided that's not a good enough reason for the story to be on the list, so I replaced it with another story from the same book. The reason this story is on here is because it feels very low stakes. So Terence has an accident that results in rocks falling on the line, and if not warned in time, Thomas could have an accident. But then Thomas is warned in time and goes slowly through the area, ruining any sort of actual climax. Boring! Why couldn't this be Toby instead? Maybe the warning doesn't reach them in time. Maybe Victoria uses her brakes to stop Toby from having an accident or something. You know, something to give her any sort of thematic purpose to be in the series at all. Overall, a very anticlimactic story. Number 6. Better late than never. If I'm being honest, this is probably the story on this list I have the least to say about. As you all know, this story was written in the book More About Thomas the Tank Engine for the TV series, and the end result kinda shows. This story is honestly kinda bland and not much happens in it. It isn't as bad as the adaptation, but I'm still not a fan. I do think the moral is good, but it wasn't executed very well. Overall, I don't have too much to say about it, as it has already been talked about to death. But basically, it's a very bland story and it has good illustrations. Number 5. Pop Special. Speaking of bland, been there, done that, nothing stories, here's another one. Yeah, this story is easily one of the most hated Railway series stories, even getting a whole video dedicated to it, and I honestly can't blame them. All that happens is that some Boy Scouts are thirsty, so Duncan goes to a shop to get them some soda. Unfortunately, the shop they go to has no soda, so Duncan has the most amazing, wonderful, special, unthinkable idea of going to another shop that does have soda, and is declared a hero by the Scouts. That's it. That's the whole story. Seriously? You're telling me that his driver couldn't think of going to another shop? What? I also have to say, why is Duncan the main character of this one? He's not even written as Duncan, he's just some generic nice guy. This story would have benefited better with either Peter, Sam, or Rusty. Or if you want to keep Duncan as the lead character, show some character growth for him. Maybe at the beginning, Duncan is being a typical grump complaining about people helping out others, even those they don't know about. Then when he sees some thirsty Boy Scouts, he feels bad and decides to help them out. Unfortunately, all the shops on the railway are out of soda. Then Duncan remembers a van containing soda in the yards at Croven's Gate. But when he goes to fetch it, the van is already leaving on Henry's goods train. It then becomes a big epic chase scene with Duncan racing to catch Henry's train. He eventually does, and delivers the soda to the Boy Scouts. See? I f***ing fixed it! And even added a climax to make the story all the more exciting. Overall, this story is bland and forgettable. It definitely had potential, but it falls flat for me. Number 4. Percy and the Trousers. This is the only Wilbur Awdry story on the list. Christopher's books were definitely a mixed bag and not as good as his father's, but his father wasn't perfect either, and this story is proof of that. For starters, this story is once again extremely unrelated to the book it's featured in. This story is placed in the book Henry the Green Engine, and yet Henry only appears in one illustration and has one line of dialogue. The story itself is also a bit too short for my liking. You need a bit more to flesh it out. This is one of the few examples where the TV adaptation is better, as that adaptation adds extra scenes at the beginning and the end to flesh out the story more. And it's placed in season 3, which makes more sense in my opinion. Overall, not much more to say other than this story is easily the worst of Wilbert's tenure. Number 3. Percys Porridge. And now we get to the really terrible stories. The stories I previously talked about aren't necessarily awful, just not all that great, but these next 3 are absolutely awful. My main problem with this story in particular is that it feels like an excuse to get Wilbur on Thomas's branch line, because Thomas was the most marketable character at the time. I swear, if Christopher had his way, he would have made the whole book take place on Duck's branch line. We could have had a whole story about Wilbur learning how to handle auto coaches, or maybe a story about Wilbur putting the ballast trucks in their place. Or how about a story about Wilbur and the small railway engines? The story opportunities on Duck's branch are endless. The stuff Wilbur does on Thomas's branch is not that memorable. He didn't need to be there. The only reason he's there is because the publishers will get mad if he isn't. Okay, so what about the story itself? It sucks. So, a sack of oatmeal falls onto the tracks and the rain turns it into porridge. Percy then comes along and runs over the porridge, and he has to go to the works for it? What? Percy is like a 20-ton steam engine, and a sack of porridge was enough to damage him? I was literally just talking about a story where Percy runs over a luggage trolley and gets covered with jam, and yet he seemingly went back to work as if nothing happened. So a luggage trolley isn't enough to damage him, but a sack of porridge is? I'm sorry, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I get that this story was written as a writing exercise by some children and the book is dedicated to them, but that's not enough to save this story for me. Sorry, these kids are adults now, so I can criticize it. Overall, this story feels like one out of the Miller era. You know, the era where engines often have really serious crashes and yet they go back to work just fine, or sometimes they have minor crashes but still have to go to the works because of it. Yeah, that era. I feel if it wasn't for Thomas's popularity, we could have gotten a whole book set on the Little Western. There's way more potential on that branch than Thomas's. Number 2. Buffer bashing. Well, what do you know? Another unrelated story from the finale book of the series. Except unlike Thomas and the Swan, there is no excuse for this. Even ignoring that, the story is terrible. So, at the beginning of the story, Donald bumps into buffers due to icy rails, and the engines tease him for it. The Fat Controller, however, only warns him to be more careful, as he knows it wasn't Donald's fault. Alright. The next day, the same thing happens to Douglas. The workmen get furious at him for smashing up their buffers, and so does Sir Topham Hatt? What? How was the accident at any means Douglas's fault? It's not like he was being careless and wasn't paying attention. His brakes simply failed. I can understand why the workmen would be upset, but Sir Topham Hatt? No way. It would be one thing if Douglas was boasting about sightings earlier in the story, but he wasn't. So it's not Donald's fault that the rails were icy, but it's Douglas's fault his brakes had failed? Somebody's playing favorites. Overall, the story is nothing, and the ending was far too cruel towards Douglas. And the number 1 worst story of the whole Railway series is I Named This Engine. Yep, this is the worst one. I legit had to look up the story for this video because I totally forgot what the story was. So at the beginning of the story, the engines are all asking the workers what the engine's name is. Then they wonder why the name is being kept a secret from them. This plot point is never followed up on. We never find out why. Anyway, Scarlowe sets off to collect the guests the next day. Then the rest of the story is about him dealing with pigs. I'm sorry, what? What does this have to do with anything this book is about? How does this tie to Ivo Hugh's introduction? What is this? Funny how for a book called New Little Engine, the New Little Engine doesn't do anything and only appears for 3 illustrations. Why did they build him? Why is he there? What is his personality? No one knows. This book is easily Chris's worst book, as all the stories are unrelated and all of them are forgettable. Why couldn't the book be about Ivo Hugh? You know, the New Little Engine? The first story could be about Sir Handel trying to come up with a name for the new engine. Then the next story, I Named This Engine, is when Ivo Hugh is introduced, and then replace Speed Killer and Dirty Water with 2 stories about Ivo Hugh. Maybe one of them could be about the Ivo Hugh and the Zoo Cars pack from the Wooden Railway Range. Overall, the story is very meandering, forgettable, and is easily the worst story of the whole Railway series if you ask me.